Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sweatpants BI. It's Sean here. A little while ago, I came across a pretty fun data set, for me at least, around the history of Lego products. Specifically, like the years that the toys came out and how those offerings from Lego have sort of changed over time. And this was the perfect data set to sort of kick around an idea that I had had in Power BI now that so many additional really cool features have come out with your ability to add additional elements to visuals and also custom data labels. So as someone who really likes designing sort of time series visuals and building out more narrative elements and data storytelling elements in Power BI, most of the time just using Power BI's native data visuals, I thought that it would be really cool to sort of visualize Lego's increasing number of products over time, but also add, in kind of a time series-like nature, a whole bunch of different factoids and sort of narrative elements right on the line chart to sort of explain, what are some of the milestones that happened over the past 50 years or so, to sort of encapsulate why Lego has grown, why they've expanded so many of their products, and sort of what has happened along the way. So in this video, I just wanted to sort of lay out how I took, a fairly standard time series data set and built in those narrative elements so that you can take your line chart and really just make for a more dynamic experience. I feel like all the time working in the corporate world, when we visualize time series data, we also want to be able to sort of call out things that specifically happened so that we can sort of compare if we're seeing a trend move up or down. What are the things that we did historically and when did we do them so that we might understand, what changed that could be driving a change in some kind of a trend. So this data set was a super basic way that I knew that I could sort of demonstrate that narrative technique that I had in my mind for the line chart. And of course, I'm very, very excited to share it with you. So let's move over to Power BI and look at our Lego data set so that I can show you how I set that up. So once we pull in our data, honestly, you might be surprised at how quickly the data narration elements of the line chart actually go. It wasn't that bad to set up, which was the whole reason that I tried it for my Lego infographic. So first, let's just go ahead and connect to our data real fast. It's just a CSV called Lego Sets. It's not a terribly large data set, and so I'm not going to bother modeling it or anything. We're just going to work with the raw data here. Let's go ahead and hit close and apply. And since we're only demonstrating a single line chart here, we're only going to have to create one measure. And that measure is just going to be a count of all the individual Lego sets. So we're going to call this Lego set count. And for that, we're just counting. Technically you can count to anything from the data set, but just to be consistent, let's count our set IDs. One other thing that you can do here is let's just go to our set IDs and make sure that we're working with only distinct values. So 18,457 Lego data sets that we're working with. Now let's go ahead and just grab a line chart. I'm going to go ahead and close my filter pane since it's just going to get in the way. Let's go ahead and drag our Lego set count over here. One thing I'm going to do while I'm thinking about it is let's just add a comma. 18,457. Let's add year to our x-axis. That's exactly how it should look. You should really notice how Lego has been releasing, an insanely large number of new sets every year, really kicking off in about 1991. And then from there, it just kind of surges all the way to 2022 when there are 967 new Lego sets. So what we're trying to do here is to this line, we're going to add some narrative elements that just really helps sort of summarize the history of Lego and maybe highlight a few things that are really driving this gigantic increase in diversification of Lego's product portfolio. So first, let's go ahead and clean up our line chart a little bit and just kind of get this more in lockstep with the infographic visual that I'm demonstrating here. So first things first, let's go ahead and go to our formatting settings for our line chart here. I'm trying to get my DAX out of the way. There we go. So the first thing that we're going to do is I'm just going to format the x-axis real quickly. I'm going to turn off my title for year because it's pretty obvious that these are years. And if it's not obvious, it is going to be by the time I add a good descriptive title to this. But just having year as a title, doesn't really add much. I think it's super obvious that these are years. And if it's not, once again, we're going to make it obvious before we release this thing. Next, I'm going to make those years nice and big to sort of drive home the fact that this is a time series visual that we're looking at. I'm even going to add a small flourish of color here. And for once, I'm actually demonstrating something using Power BI's default color palette. Since we're not going to be using a lot of it anyway, it doesn't really hurt anything, even though when I was building my infographic, I did sort of source all of my colors from the classic Lego bricks. I mean, Lego has such an iconic color palette, it seemed like a waste to not use it. But for this, we're just going to use blue. And I'm even going to try bolding these a little bit just to really drive home the connection that we're looking at this information broken down by decade. Now let's go up here to our y-axis. And I'm just going to go ahead and make my y-axis values DIN as well. Let's go ahead and increase their size a little bit. And for these, I don't want them to be so dark. I'm going to kind of suppress those by making them a little bit lighter. I want people to be able to read these, but I really don't want them to be the focal point of my visual. There's already going to be so much happening here. And I'm going to add everything that I need to this chart that in my actual infographic, I didn't even keep the y-axis. I am going to keep it here, but I'm going to suppress it by giving it a really light color so that when someone's looking at this, their eyes are immediately drawn to this blue, so that they know that the blue is what they're supposed to be focusing on. Next, I'm going to switch my axis position and I'm going to move it over here. And let's also give our y-axis a slightly more descriptive title here. So let's call this total number of new Lego sets by year. I'm going to increase it a little bit, italicize it, and I'm also going to use kind of a light gray there. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do is let's go ahead and add for our effects. Well, first of all, I definitely don't need a background there. We are going to come back and give this a much more descriptive title when we're done with it. For my grid lines, I'm going to turn off my vertical grid lines. I am going to leave my horizontal grid lines in case somebody is looking at a specific dot here and they're having a hard time sort of mapping it to the y-axis values. I'm also going to increase the size just a little bit. And then I'm going to make this a little bit lighter just so that it's barely there, but you can still make it out faintly. Next, let's go ahead and open up our markers and our line options here. And for my line color, I'm going to go much lighter, just kind of a light blue, barely there. And for my markers, I'm going to increase these quite a bit. And for my marker colors, I'm going to go with that dark blue again, so that mostly the markers are what someone would notice when they're looking at this. You know, that might be a little bit big. Let's try dropping these down just a little bit more. Okay. The next thing that I want to do is I want to go ahead and start bringing in my narrative elements. And I will say that for my Lego infographic, I did it all in DAX. That was just a personal preference. I was kind of playing around with it. And then I realized about halfway through that honestly, setting this up in DAX was kind of a pain in the butt. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to manually input all of my narrative elements. And all of the narration, all of the historical tidbits that I brought in are just little factoids that I found, I think, on Wikipedia. And what I did was I just mapped those to individual years that I wanted to highlight here. I think that I mapped like 19 historical tidbits. That's a lot. I figured go big or go home since I was just kind of playing around. You don't necessarily have to map 19. In fact, I probably wouldn't recommend it. I'd probably say, why don't you just do like half that number? But we're going to map 19 different data points here. There are all of my years that I mapped to the visual. I'm just creating a new table here. And then the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to need to plot y-axis coordinates that sort of place the individual historical factoids around our main KPI line here. Because we have a whole bunch of white space here, we want some of our factoids to occupy this area. And especially from 2000 to 2022, we want to make sure that we're utilizing a lot of this space. I'm also going to map some negative values here so that my axis will shift up a little bit and I'll be able to fit some text sort of below the line here. So I'm going to distort the axis a little bit here just to sort of drive the point home. You know, at the end of the day, this is a very narrative visual. So I'm taking the risk of just sort of allowing there to be some negative points here. What I'm not going to want to have happen is that the data points sort of confuse my main line here. So I'm going to have to get pretty creative with the formatting of my narrative text. But first, What we're going to do here is we're going to drop some y-axis coordinates here, and based on where this line runs, you can imagine that those narrative elements are going to kind of range between, let's say, negative 200 and 1200, so that I can fully occupy all of the white space above and beneath the line for my little factoid. So I'm just going to go ahead and copy and paste all of those y-axis coordinates that I already wrote. So you'll notice that for 1970, negative 150, and you can see over here that this line occupies, let's say, 50. So for negative 150, I'm going to see the factoid kind of down here. Then for 1973, 650, that one's going to be, you know, almost all the way up here. So, you know, and then you'll notice that these numbers kind of flip back and forth between being negative and positive. That's so that all of my historical factoids are kind of evenly distributed on either side of the line. And then from 2002 to 2022, you'll notice that I no longer have any negative numbers. And that's because suddenly I've got plenty of space over here above zero for a lot of that narrative text. So I no longer need to go beneath zero. Just early on, when my lines are kind of close to the bottom of the y-axis, do I need to go negative so that I have room for all of those factoids? So let's go ahead first and load in our table, and I'm going to call this just z underscore narrative. The Z underscore is just my personal way of naming some of these manually inputted tables that aren't dynamic, so that I can kind of keep them together. And if something is Z underscore, that's just my personal way of sort of labeling that this is a table that I manually created. Let's go ahead and load this in. Next thing we're going to do is go over to our relationship builder. We're just going to make sure that everything got mapped. It looks pretty good to me. Now, the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to change this to both directions. And let's go ahead and drop our y-axis coordinate here. Right now, it's just counting my y-axis, which is not what I want. I want it to sum. Good. And of course, we end up with this big, crazy line sort of zigzagging back and forth. And if we left it this way, oh my gosh, it would be so distracting, right? But remember, this line is not intended to represent real data. All we want are the little markers that are going to sort of highlight where there's going to be a label for some sort of historical thing that happened. So first, let's decrease the absolute insane amount of noise here by getting rid of that dark blue line. So let's open up our sum of y-axis, and for our stroke width for that line, we're going to reduce it all the way down to 0, and now it's gone. Next, let's go ahead and open up our colors. And it looks like that's not going to matter. We've already got a dark blue line there. So let's open up our markers instead. Sum of y-axis. I don't want blue markers, which are the same color that I'm using in my count of Lego sets KPI, because I don't want to take the risk of someone looking at this and thinking that like these blue dots are related to this line. Like right now, this almost looks like I plotted a regression or something through a bunch of data points, and like maybe these are outliers. I want to make sure that people don't think that these are a part of the blue line. So I definitely want to use a different color, and I definitely want to use something super, super subtle. So let's try just going light gray on these. I want these dots to barely be there, because they're just there to sort of mark where my little historical factoids are going to go. The next thing that we're going to do here is let's go ahead and head up here to where we can add additional analytics elements to our line chart, and I'm going to turn on my error bars. And currently, my error bars don't have anything to map. So I don't think it really hypothetically matters which order you do this, but for my upper bound, I want to use my y-axis coordinate. And for my lower bound, I want to use the Lego set count. It is very important that you use the blue line measure that you have here so that your dots will get mapped directly back to that line. So let's try mixing it up a little bit just to see if this still works. Notice that currently it's saying count of y-axis, so it keeps defaulting back to that. Not a big deal. We're just going to change it back to sum of y-axis, which is what we want. And now we've got exactly what we should have, and that is that we have these gray bars leading to our light gray markers for our timeline elements. Now, I want to, emphasize, the values that we hard coded into our y-axis values can be manually changed to suit your needs. If you would like to have a dot be lower or higher or farther away from the y-axis, all you have to do is go back to your narrative element and just keep playing with these y-axis values until you're happy with where they're all plotted. When I was building my infographic, once I was, relatively happy with, how everything looked, I just kind of stopped. I was like, I've got enough to at least demonstrate the concept and show that it works. But, you may prefer, your narrative elements to be distributed differently with regard to the blue line. Totally fine. This is just the way that I built it. I just want to make sure that you understand there's nothing, forcing you or mandating you to use the specific y-axis values that I used. So tweak these until you're happy with the presentation here and you're able to, clearly show all of your narrative elements. So now that we've got everything pretty well set up, let's head back to that table that we hard coded. Let's open it back up and let's actually add our narration. And I'm just going to copy and paste these from an Excel table that I had set up to make this a little bit easier. Once again, all of these narration elements are just taken directly from Wikipedia. I will say that I did spend quite a bit of time editing these to make them as short as possible. Since, at least at the time that I'm recording this video, these custom data labels in Power BI don't enable anything like word wrap per se. You do want to make sure that your text blurbs aren't too long, otherwise they're just going to run into each other. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Let's go ahead and load these in. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to create an additional column here. So I'm going to add a column and I'm going to merge my year and narration columns. For merging, it is important that you select them in the proper order. So let's select our year column first and then narration, and then let's merge those columns. And we're going to merge them with a colon and a space in between year and narration. And we're going to call this year narration as our column header. And there's the colon and the space that we added as our merge character. So now we have the year and the thing that happened. Let's go ahead and load those back in. And now we're going to go back to our line chart. We're going to expand our data labels and first turn them on. And of course, the first thing that we need to do for our data labels is we need to hide the data labels on our blue line. That is just way too much information. We don't need all of that. So for our Lego set count, let's turn those off. And then of course, the y-axis values up here that are plotted, those just don't really mean much at all. They were totally random numbers that we assigned just to, distribute our little factoids. So we're going to change our sum of y-axis with something else. So we're going to, instead of using our values here, let's instead, there we go, detail. So instead of detail, what we're going to use is our year narration column. I'm just going to go ahead and drop that in there. It says first year, that's totally fine. And you'll notice that right now, the y-axis coordinate is plotted alongside our little factoid. Now that we have our factoids plotted in our details, we can get rid of the y-axis coordinate, the 1000, the 700, the 1200, those don't matter. So let's turn off the value. And now we're just left with our little factoids there. Now we're going to go to our detail formatting, and we're going to change this to DIN. I'm going to increase the size a little bit. That's all looking pretty good. The next thing that I'm going to do is you'll notice that let me change that back real quickly. You'll notice that a few of the dots are not being plotted. So let's try playing with the density of our labels and increasing those values until everything appears here. And that's all looking pretty good. You may notice that there are some instances where the text is sort of covering up the dot, like up here with 2022 Lego Group celebrates 90th anniversary. One other thing that you can sort of play around with is increasing the setting of your y-axis. So let's see if we can move that around a little bit. We're just sort of customizing this until we're relatively happy with how it looks. Again, this is kind of a presentation video. Not everything, necessarily has to adhere to in the strictest sense to best practices for data visualization. Like having my y-axis start up here, probably not best practice, but we're doing the best that we can to sort of fit in all of our narrative elements. And it looks like everything is now plotted. It looks pretty decent to me. The next thing that I'm going to do is we're going to add just a few more elements to this visual just to sort of round it out here. So first, let's go to our detail again. And I'm just going to go ahead and make these values a little bit lighter, because what I'm ultimately going to do is not all of these values are things that I'm going to highlight. Or in other words, like really, really spotlight. Some of these values I think are more important than others. For example, I'm not sure, how important Lego Ninjago is. I'm going to kind of suppress that to the background. Maybe the Lego Pirates theme is not as important as the first licensed theme, which is Star Wars. So I'm going to suppress some of these and highlight others. But for now, I'm just trying to get a nice gray. And I'm just going to go ahead and copy this BFB DBD. Okay. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to assign stronger colors to some of these labels and that light gray color that I just copied to others. So let's go ahead and call this next measure that I'm writing narrative color. And for this, I'm going to say that if the selected year, or in other words, if the year that is being evaluated at any given point in this chart is in the following years, and for this I'm going to include 1974, 1983, 1996, 1999 when the Star Wars toys were introduced, 2014 when the Lego movie released, 2017 when the Lego Batman movie released, which is probably my personal favorite of the Lego movies. If the year appears in those, I'm going to give it one color. Otherwise, I'm going to give it that gray color that we copied. So the next thing that I need to do is I need to figure out a good highlight color for what I consider to be the most important elements here. So let's go ahead and head back out. Just going to click anywhere. Let's go to our background colors, and honestly, let's go ahead and just see what are some colors that might play well with that blue line. Let's open up our details here. Kind of thinking maybe orange, maybe purple, maybe even just the same blue that I used. I think I'm just going to use that blue. Okay, so the color for that blue is 118 DFF. Let's go back to our narrative color now, and let's identify that as the color that we want to use just for these years that we listed here. The next thing that we need to do is, because we can conditionally format these custom data labels, let's click on this FX here, which indicates that we can use conditional formatting. And instead of using a gradient, let's use field value, and let's go find our narrative color here, and let's change it to that. And so now you can see all of my quote-unquote less important factoids are now rendered in that light gray, and what I consider to be the more important factoids are rendered in that blue. So now let's go back to our error bars, and you'll notice that that dark gray that I chose for my error bars is kind of, causing some more noise, and it's interrupting some of my data labels. So I'm going to open up my error bars, and I'm going to open up my bar options, and I'm just going to go super light on that. I'm also going to reduce my marker size just a little bit because the markers aren't terribly important. I'm just kind of playing around a little bit. That looks awful, just awful in my opinion. So I'm just going to leave it white. Okay, on the whole, that's looking pretty decent to me. We've got, enough, sort of highlighted historical tidbits to sort of pull someone in. Again, I probably chose too many of these historical tidbits just because I was kind of having fun and building my infographic. Some of these, if you really wanted to clean up the presentation of this, just start dropping some of these gray ones. If they're gray and, we're already saying that they're maybe less important, why visualize them at all? So there's definitely ways that you can sort of clean up this visual. But the next thing that we're going to do real quickly is I'm just going to add a couple of additional elements here just to sort of drive home this increase in the number of data sets. So I'm going to create one more measure here. And this is going to be 1970, because what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a nice big label for the 41 down here. And then I'm going to create another measure to add a nice big label for the 967 up here. But first, I need to calculate my, my Lego set count, but just for that specific year. So year equals 1970. Whoop. That would have been like medieval or dark age Lego set, the way that I had typed that. And let's go ahead and do the same thing, but we're going to do it for the last data point, which is 2022. Now let's go ahead and add both of these to our chart. And it's a good sign that I immediately see the 41 and the 967 popping up. That's exactly what I wanted to see happen. Now let's go to our data labels and let's click on 1970. Let's click on value. I'm going to use DIN again, and I'm going to bold it. And I'm going to make it nice and obnoxiously huge. Let's go to 20. 20 is a good even number. And now let's go all the way back up to 2022. We'll choose DIN. I'm going to use 20 again as my font. I'm going to bold it and use 967 there. Okay, now that we're done with that, really the only thing that's left to do to sort of round out this visual is just giving it a nice title. So let's click on our chart here. One thing I am going to do is, because I have sort of customized the crap out of this line chart, my legend here is no longer terribly important. So let's go ahead and turn off the legend. One other thing that I'm thinking is that it might be helpful to someone to go ahead and put my title here in blue to help them understand that, you know, this line here that they're looking at in blue, this is the title of that measure. This is what they're actually looking at, because it's not necessarily immediately clear what's being visualized here. And for my y-axis values, I'm going to sort of do the same thing. I don't want them to be too distracting, but I am going to give them sort of a light blue color. There we go. Okay, the next thing that I'm going to do is let's go ahead and give this a really good title here. So between 1970, what we're really trying to say in this visual is that between 1970 and 2022, the number of new Lego sets released has surged, increasing from only 41 in 1970 to almost 1,000 in 2022. Got plenty of room for that, so let's go ahead and increase it. Let's really utilize that space at the top of the page there. And I'm going to put my title in blue as well to sort of help users understand what they're looking at here. Let's go back to my title here. I'm going to bold it. And then for my subtitle, I'm going to call out some of the specific factoids down here and their importance. So this increase has likely been driven by Lego diversifying its product offerings, starting with licensed content in 1999 and expanding into film and other media in 2014 with the Lego Movie. Just trying to add a little bit more, sort of character and intrigue to the title that we have up here so that users know exactly what they're looking at, and also, sort of highlights why we made some of the stylistic choices that we made in this visual. Thanks for checking out that tutorial on Sweatpants BI, everybody. Again, really excited to sort of show you that specific trick for how I add some narrative elements to some data visuals using many of the newer features that Power BI has released in recent months to sort of help you customize a lot of your data visuals even further. That was a super fun data set to work with. I'm an 80s kid, so I'm a huge Lego fan. I definitely grew up with Legos. If you enjoyed that content, feel free to sound off in the comments. If you really enjoyed it, feel free to like or subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And I will be sure to see you next time on Sweatpants BI. Thank you so much, everyone.